Today, our topic is media literacy, and we've got two great people to visit with. Chris Allen, a career that spans being a disc jockey all the way to being an academic and training folks in radio journalism in Afghanistan, who's now retired and enjoying life. And Katrina Markle, who has an eclectic career also, having moved from documentary filmmaking, national journalism work into freelance journalism, and now as on-air journalist for local TV station. And so we're really excited to engage with these two practitioner scholars on this subject of media literacy, which is so important today. And of course, I'm Jim Martin. And Gargi, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Gargi Vyas, and Jim and I are podcast hosts of Leadership, and this is our second episode. I'm really excited about this topic, so I wanted to start off really straightforward. So, Katrina and Chris, according to you, what is media literacy? How would you define it?
I think media literacy is, first of all, lacking. Second of all, one of the most important things that we need to teach. But overall, media literacy is understanding how the media operate, what the media's roles are in society, in politics, in education, in consumerism, and all of those things, and understanding the language of the media, the process of the media, and the ability to be critical consumers of the media, not cynical, but critical consumers of the media.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Chris said. And, this is similar to what he was saying about being critical consumers of the media. I just keep thinking it goes back to having the tools that an active participant in our democracy needs to evaluate the information that they're getting, so they can discern, what is valuable, credible information and what isn't. And I do think that the media needs to play a more active role in educating our consumers about that as well. So I think media literacy is a two-way street. Those of us that are in the press need to actually take a role in educating folks, and maybe a way that we didn't before, in a way that maybe 50 years ago there was a sort of, well, just trust us. We're network news, just trust us. And you can't do that anymore.
I mean, I was around 50 years ago. That's when I started my media career. It was about 50 years ago. And you're exactly right. Made an active decision not to cover itself. Nobody wants to know about us. They want to know about the news, not us. And that's patently not true. We need to be more transparent as media practitioners, as media organizations, how decisions are made, why decisions are made. It's like the New York Times a few weeks ago, after the attack on Israel, published a headline and a story that was attributed entirely to the Palestinians, and it was misleading. And the Times, a few days later, retracted that and said, this is how that decision got made. We need to do that. We need to be transparent in that way.
Yeah, to that point, is educating folks about media literacy, either external consumers of media or within media itself, more challenging today than it was in the past?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know that we did it much in the past. I've been in and out of news, and I've been in online marketing, which absolutely dovetails with media literacy today. I think that we weren't transparent enough in the past, but I also think that media consumers in the past, there were gatekeepers, right? So it's not that people today are less well educated about how media works. In fact, they may be more well educated about it. It's just in the past you didn't need to be. There were 3 networks plus public media. Pre-cable news, and even in the early days of cable news, when that operated a little bit differently, there were gatekeepers. And so you didn't have to necessarily worry about the information that you were consuming. There was, your city newspaper, maybe there was more than one city newspaper. There were the network news. And what I mean for younger folks out there, what I mean when I say network, I mean the broadcast over the air network. So the big three, ABC, CBS, and NBC, because I've worked with young people now who refer to network news as also Fox and CNN and MSNBC. So that didn't exist. And it was, there was something called the Fairness Doctrine, I think, that was repealed about 1987. And that ensured some level of balance in coverage. So when all that went away, and also conservative talk radio came in and became a big force, the media environment became more complicated. It's kind of all a roundabout way of saying it wasn't necessary before. We had gatekeepers. Now it's necessary to educate people on media literacy. And I think part of that is us explaining our own process, but there are bigger issues at work here, and I can really get into the weeds about all of the complicated intersecting issues around being media literate, I think now.
What I've been thinking about for really the last couple of years is that media literacy really begins in grade school. We talk about media literacy in high school and in college, and it's late at that point. Going back to the readers that first and second grade readers, when I was just learning to read, it was see Jane run Jane run, and the next question should be, why is Jane running? We need to start questioning the process of thinking critically at that point. And that's what media literacy is. It's thinking critically about the media. But, back in the late 70s, when I was working in Des Moines at radio news, I would have, I remember specifically somebody stopped me. It wasn't just somebody on the street, but it was somebody said, "Why aren't you covering this story?" I forget what the story was. And I said, what story is that? Well, nobody's covering it except the newspaper. And I said, what newspaper? The National Enquirer. It's not a newspaper. It's on newsprint, and it looks like a newspaper, and there are columns just like a newspaper, but it's not a newspaper. And there was no differentiation. And so I think that's one of the, and that continues today. Nobody is differentiating. Well, nobody. Many people are not differentiating between the commentators and the reporters. There are a lot of really great reporters all over the place. It's the commentators that get confused with the reporters in many people's minds that say, oh, that news organization is biased. And it may be, but really, that's one of the things that's made it so much harder. And then there are the hidden ones, the ones that are the echo chambers, the ones that are simply manufacturing things to get clicks, to get people excited, to persuade people. There's no factual foundation for anything they're saying. And that has made it enormously difficult and enormously important to emphasize media literacy.
Well, and I think if I can build on what Chris said too, this is where it does intersect with things like emotional intelligence and awareness of how government works. And again, the structure of the media, because you brought up the Enquirer, and that's a great example because that's been going on for a while. I think back to the 2016 election. This was a hoax website. It wasn't even a Russian fake news site, but it was a fake news site. It was genuinely fake news. There was a headline, and it looked like a real newspaper, and it was called the Denver Guardian. Now, if you are a news nerd, you know that the paper of record in Denver is the Denver Post, but you don't need to be a news nerd to first of all, look at that and go like, I've never heard of the Denver Guardian. I wonder what that is. Like, so that's like, we're getting into tips and tools, but that's the first question to ask when you see something and a headline that catches your attention. The headline was Pope endorses Donald Trump. Now, if you know how governments work, if you know that the Vatican is its own sovereign nation, the Pope is not going to put his thumb on the scale for an American presidential candidate. Also, if you've been paying attention earlier in that election cycle, you know that the Pope had been somewhat critical of, without naming Trump, he had been somewhat critical of some statements Trump had made on immigration. And it was pretty obvious where Pope Francis was going with that. but it was getting shared by well-educated people, Catholic people, who weren't recognizing that they had an emotional reaction to this. And so they were sharing it by like, oh my God, I knew it. That was kind of the reaction. And so they didn't have the tools to sit back for a second and think, wait a minute, have I heard of this news outlet? Maybe I should look it up. Because even if you've heard of the news outlet, like you've heard of the National Enquirer, but maybe you haven't taken that second step to dig into it before you share that story. So they didn't do that. And I feel bad calling out these very nice ladies. They didn't step back and think, hey, this headline, I'm only reading the headline. The headline is causing me to react emotionally, either negatively or really positively, because it's either reinforcing what I want to believe or it's making me angry, right? One or the other. They didn't step back and analyze it from that level. And then again, like there was a lacking in education to just know that the Pope doesn't do that. That's just not something the Pope would do. So there were like 3 things along the way, but even if they didn't have that knowledge about how the world works or how politics works or what the paper of record is in Denver, they could have stepped back and recognized, I'm having an emotional reaction to this. And what is this news outlet that's reporting it? And those are kind of the basic tools. I think if you drill down, I've gotten into the weeds here on this conversation because this was not your question, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot, is like, how do we give the tools so that everyone can have it and they don't have to have this sort of high level of interest in news and politics and world affairs to still take a story and say, well, is this something I should really be sharing or be believing? So I don't remember what the original question was, but something Chris said triggered that for me.
I think you're still on track with the last question, because our question was, is achieving or dealing with media literacy more challenging in the present compared to the past? So I thought that was an excellent example of how many hurdles consumers might have to jump through with the increased number of actors that are biased, unbiased, real, fake. So I definitely think that was a great exemplification of the question. And it leads really nicely into the next question that I have for both of you. As I was preparing for this podcast, this question came up to me. Once you start thinking about media literacy, you might wonder, am I media literate? So I was wondering if you all could provide some indicators of media literacy, like something one could use to grade or score themselves on the scale of not media literate at all to like quite literate. Would you have some indicators to share?
Well, I think there are several people who can ask themselves, do I simply swallow, what I read without question? Do I double check source? Do I double check the story? Do I look at who is named in the story, who is cited in the story? Do I look at the words that are used? Are they inflammatory words? Because the legacy news media will not use outrageous. They will not use blood curdling. They will not use, words like that. But many of the false sites or the less trustworthy sites will. Do I read more than one source? Do I have a knowledge of what government is, how government works, who the players are in government, and what the recent news trends have been, the legitimate news trends, the stories? Am I engaged in looking at this gets to, the graduate level. Do I read the journals that keep an eye on the news? The Gateway News Journal, the Columbia Journalism Review, things like that do keep an eye on what the media are doing.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, building on that too, we absolutely make mistakes. So there's nothing wrong with reading a story in legacy media and thinking something about this, is it setting right for me? And like Chris has said, like looking at it critically, not necessarily cynically, because we're human, we make mistakes. We are under, especially in TV, gosh, we're under time constraints. Yesterday I started out thinking I was going to do one story. I did a completely different story, and then I had a bunch of technical problems. And if there had been a lot of fact checking involved in that particular story, it would have been a struggle to turn it in on time and do a good job with it. So when you're looking at us critically and you think like a legitimate mistake has been made, you can certainly contact us, especially if you're involved in that story, and looking at a news outlet that do they issue corrections when they make mistakes, because we're all going to. But I think in terms of grading people or thinking about your own media literacy, it's really tough. I would say like consuming a variety of news sources and not just staying within even your comfort zone. We've all, this is the other thing, social media plays a huge factor in this, right? So we've all kind of, to use a word that Jim and I joke about a little bit, we've all curated our own our own social media feeds. So we live in an echo chamber anyway, because social media's goal is just to keep you on there longer. So it's going to keep you on there longer by keeping you angry or keeping you consuming things that reinforce what you already believe. So what you see in your social media may be totally different from what I see in my social media. And if you're just getting your news story, and social media is now downplaying news, so that it is much harder for legacy media organizations to get our news stories out there through social media. It's consuming a variety of news, seeking it out. This is all time consuming though, right? And it's hard for the average news consumer with a busy life to do this. Okay, so let's just say you're watching, I work for CBS station, you're watching the CBS evening news, but you're not sure that they're getting everything that's happening in the world. It's a half an hour. It's very American focused. Go to public media, not government run media, but publicly funded media in little L liberal Western democracies. So maybe BBC World is doing, DW TV, the German public media outlet. And there's NHK actually in Japan. Sometimes there's some of those outlets that might give you a different perspective. So I think it's like, is your media diet diverse and healthy and maybe outside your comfort zone a little bit? I don't know if that's quite where you were going with this. It's really hard to grade. I wouldn't even give myself an A+ on media literacy. I listen to podcasts that definitely reinforce how I feel about things because I find it comforting, except that I'm at least aware that that's what I'm doing. And I think some people aren't even aware that that's what they're doing. And I'm talking about well-educated people who aren't, on both sides or across the spectrum that do that. So that's my 2 cents. I can talk forever. So I'll throw it back to you.
A few weeks ago, On the Media, the NPR program On the Media, which is one of the media watchdog programs. That's not exclusively what it does, but it does watch the media. It's a podcast. It's also broadcast on NPR stations, many of them. They issued 7 guidelines for, in this case, watching the war in Israel, in Gaza. If I can, I'll just run these down because these are specific to the war, but they're generalizable to news consumers. 1, headlines are obscured by the fog of war. Don't swallow them without chewing. Even the best news outlets will blow it. 2, avoid the obvious spreaders of hogwash by noting these red flags. And I know we're going to get into this a little bit later. These are the red flags. Incessant posts that lead into emotionally charged content that provide no link to an original source and use language of breaking news without being affiliated with a news outlet. Number 3, check the attribution and be careful of the sources they're pulling from. Know your platforms, know who's posting, know sort of the news philosophy of that. Photos and videos of war are almost never staged by crisis actors. A lot of people say, "Oh, that's a fake photo. That was all staged." No, they just don't do that. Learn about the easily accessible tools you can use to assist verification. The information pool has never been so polluted. Don't make it worse. Pause before you post. what you do matters. Those are the 7 guidelines. You can go to onthemedia.org and find those. I went through them pretty quickly. But I listened to that a couple of weeks ago, and I thought, wow, that's, what a great set of guidelines for verifying what you're consuming.
And On the Media, I listen to it sometimes on Sunday mornings when I'm doing dishes or getting my coffee. And that is meant for a general audience. That is not journalists making content for other journalists. It's helpful as a journalist, but I think it is useful because it gives insight as well to how the credible news media, how we analyze and critique ourselves, and sometimes the thought processes behind telling certain stories. So I'm glad that you really brought that up, Chris, because that is something that I feel is accessible to a lot of people and isn't just, Picture.org or Columbia Journalism Review. It's something that's easy for people to find and listen to in the car or whatever.
Yeah. So essentially sounds like you all are advocating for mix in a little fruits and vegetables with your fries and burger, and thinking carefully through, what you're seeing. I mean, I've often seen things where that kind of curated stuff where it's like, this is somehow picked up that I'm going to emotionally engage with this subject. And just to take a minute, take a breath and be, okay, I know that this kind of plays on what I think, but work it through, right?
Right. And don't just, and this came up with what Chris was reading, don't just read the headlines. I mean, just to give you a real world example, because I was the digital manager here before I started doing online reporting. And before that, did quite a lot of digital marketing while I was doing magazine writing. We have limited space for headlines, and we are forced into a situation because social media is so dominant, right? We're forced into a situation where we have to find the balance between writing something that's clickbait, which would be a really emotionally charged headline that's not accurate and just getting people to click. And then you read the story and it's completely different, but writing an accurate headline that is still eye-catching. And that is a really tough balance. And sometimes we get it wrong. So, and not, again, like not on purpose. We have economic forces, including just how do we get people to click on our legit stories? And so, yeah, reading beyond the headline and also the looking for stories that include links to sources is also, that's huge. And I could give some examples of that. It's a good indicator of how legitimate a story is, especially if they're citing a lot of details or they're citing research.
Thinking about propaganda, which is related to all of this, I so relate to that one commercial. And Katrina, I always say this, there's a commercial where it's like, who else reads books about submarines? My dad. So I have this kind of legacy of historical information about what propaganda is. And it's like Joseph Goebbels, propaganda minister, and Soviet propaganda, and United States propaganda during World War II, and all these sorts of things. And it seems that has become more difficult to distinguish what those are. What do you two think about that?
Propaganda used to be a neutral word 150 years ago. But propaganda actually comes from agriculture, propagation of crops. It simply meant, growing crops, spreading crops. You propagate apples by splicing and things like that. The Catholic Church, grabbed onto the phrase when they created the Congregation for the Propagation of Faith. It was a tribunal, and it was just what it sounds like, to propagate Catholicism around the globe, and it began to take on a little darker tone. And then propaganda I suppose really beginning in the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and then World War I, really took on the tone of using extreme techniques to persuade people to your point of view without giving any alternative points of view, without making room for anything, and making alternative points of view sound nefarious or evil or antisocial. And that's what propaganda still is today. It is simply an extreme one-sided point of view. There are lots of times when you can express a point of view in a discussion setting, or Republicans and Democrats can debate civilly. It's not propaganda. It's when it reaches the point of this is the only right way to think, and if you don't think that way, you're antisocial, you're anti-American. In our case, you're a traitor. It's traitorous thinking, and that's what propaganda has. I think what propaganda has become.
I didn't know that whole history of propaganda. That's pretty interesting. And it is helpful, I think, in general to understand the history of anything media related, because then you understand how we got where we are. It was funny when you said you were going to ask this question. I thought of two things. I thought of, propaganda is PR on steroids. And, Chris's explanation is much more intellectual than mine. And then I also thought, and this is attributed, I think, to Oliver Wendell Holmes. So, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but he said, and this was about pornography, like it's hard to define, but I know it when I see it. And I feel that way about propaganda, but you have to develop that instinct for propaganda. Mm-hmm. I think part of media literacy is how do we get people to a point where they can develop an instinct for like something about this isn't right. And not react to their first emotion, which is either like anger or extreme agreement. So that's my non-academic explanation. It's just PR on steroids.
I really like that phrase.
But it works.
So I have a follow-up question based on how you all described ways to identify propaganda. And you identified that there is usually some appeal to intense emotional reaction. So I was wondering how to discern propaganda, because some topics naturally tend themselves to emotional responses, some thinking topics that involve strong beliefs, things around human rights. So I was wondering if you could comment on ways to really identify propaganda on topics that naturally lead to emotional responses.
I think there are layers, right? So you've got pure propaganda, then you have like commentary, which should be based on fact. It's just one person taking a point of view, but they're still making fact-based commentary. And then you have maybe what we might think of as fairly neutral news and information. I don't know if this is going to answer your question, Gargi. I think that, and I struggle with this, and I see, again, like even people that I've spent a lot of time educating on this, like my mom, who does a pretty good job, but, she will still share memes and things that she has an emotional reaction to. And I struggle with that, because even though maybe she's even making a good argument, or that meme is making a good argument, I don't think it's helpful for most of us to, it's hard to avoid consuming it because we're all getting inundated with that stuff on social media. But I don't even know that it's helpful for us to share it, because it just kind of perpetuates this tendency to react. One thing about propaganda is that it lacks depth, and good reporting will have depth, even in and this is something I'm learning right now, because I'm going from having been to an online environment and more of a print environment to having to tell a story in 90 seconds. After my journalism program, my program was more documentary focused. So you go from like telling a story 90 minutes to 90 seconds. But in 90 seconds, you can still get to some level of depth. And propaganda just doesn't have that, right? You should have a couple of different sources in it. You should have links to, maybe if you're referring to someone else's reporting or a story that happened somewhere else, there should maybe be a link to that story that you're citing. Chris, it looks like you had maybe some thoughts.
So I think it begins with a healthy dose of skepticism. Let me go back to Israel. When I first heard that that Hamas had invaded Israel, as it were, and killed thousands of people, I thought, wait a minute, let me take a step back, let me evaluate who's reporting, what the facts are, I'm not going to swallow it wholesale. I am not going to condemn Hamas right away. And then I started reading. I started looking at the sources. I started looking at the trustworthy news video. I started looking at the trustworthy reports that were coming through, and I began to form an opinion. I'll step back even farther to the 2020 election. There was a lot of propaganda about stealing the election and all of that. There was not one credible fact in the entire thing. People kept saying, I have the evidence, and people believed that they have the evidence, but it was never, ever, ever presented. Never. But people chose to believe, many did, that I have the evidence in my hand and I will reveal it on Monday. And Monday came and went and nothing was ever done. That's all propaganda. It was stolen. We know that it was stolen. It was stolen in Georgia. It was stolen in Arizona. It was stolen in Pennsylvania. Not one fact, but the propaganda continued. And the propaganda was these incidents, but the overall propaganda is that the election was stolen. That's just one example that I find is really a disturbing example, because in this whole thing, there hasn't been one fact. There is no depth, as Katrina was saying. There's no depth to any of that. Name calling is a great, when we were in World War I, the anti-war, the war posters were that we were attacking the Huns, not the Germans. There were a lot of German Americans in the United States at the time, and they were our friends, and many of us were German. There were a lot of people who were German, so we couldn't fight the Germans. We fought the Huns. The Huns have this terrible, reputation in history, and it's just like that. We did the same thing to the Japanese. Those are examples of surface appeals to emotion that have no depth, and our emotions are so at the surface. They are at that is the first line of offense that we have. It plays on our emotions, and if we don't sink below that to the depth and look at it, we will be sucked right into it.
Well, and there are modern versions of the propaganda poster. I just keep thinking about, I follow, just to see what everyone is doing, and I follow, I'm going to just call them out. I follow Fox News on Instagram, and their Instagram images and headlines are not always. Sometimes they're not. And I do click through and actually read the stories, but the headlines and the images together are often designed to be inflammatory and get a rise out of you. And they're often, that is clickbait. Clickbait is probably an offshoot of propaganda. And I've noticed that they do it a lot. I'm sure that there are other organizations that do it a lot. And you get into some gray areas too with propaganda, where maybe it's this, and again, the Fox News on Instagram would be an example of this. Maybe it's a summary of a story, but they didn't report it originally. They're picking and choosing what they're taking out of it. They're taking the most incendiary, exciting parts out of a story and not providing any context to it. And maybe not providing multiple sources. So when I say sources, I mean, not just citing like research sources, but also just interviewing people that maybe have different viewpoints or more than one viewpoint in the story. If that was helpful in terms of discerning what's propaganda. But I think it goes back to like what Chris said, be skeptical, not cynical. We're fighting right now, I think, a very heavy anti-institutional streak in this country. Yeah. So nobody trusts anything. People don't trust the FBI, and there are reasons to be skeptical about the FBI, but it's to the point where people think that every federal prosecutor, because they don't understand how government works, they think every federal prosecutor is a political operative, and that's simply not the case. So people don't trust the federal bureaucracy. People don't trust academic institutions. People don't trust legacy media. All of these institutions, including my own industry, maybe haven't done a good job building up that trust. So now the pendulum is really swinging in another direction, or swinging away from trusting anything at all, because they just don't understand how it works.
The buzzword right now is indoctrination. You know, the media are indoctrinating, the educators are indoctrinating, the you know, we have all of these institutions that have come out under fire, and the buzzword is indoctrination. And we need to mention in this discussion of propaganda, because your viewers will pick up on this. People often label advertising as propaganda. The thing is, when Coke is pushing its product that it tastes the best, there are other messages that it doesn't. There are alternatives to that. Now, overall, is advertising propaganda for commercialism? Perhaps. I'm not willing to go that far, but there are levels of propaganda too that you need to look at, and I'm not sure that, you know, promoting a dish soap or a line of clothing or something like that is propaganda. Some people will say it is, but the overall may simply be that it is propaganda for consumerism, commercialism, capitalism, you know, whatever that may be. That's how complex the issue of propaganda can be.
You're absolutely right that you can have an emotional response to a credible, well-reported news story, because, and there are some things that are just right and wrong, right? We do those stories all the time where this particular injustice has happened, or something's just emotional, like the conflict between the Israeli government and Hamas. It, regardless of where you fall in getting your opinion on regardless of where your opinion falls on that, it's just an emotional subject. But I do think that, you know, what is your reaction to? Do you have a reaction to an image and a headline and maybe a social media caption, and without digging any further into the meat of that story? Like, are you still having that emotional reaction once you've really looked into that story, and this expert and this participant and this other voice are all part of the story, and these statistics from whatever, the WHO or your city public health agency, whatever the story is about, if you're still having that emotional reaction after you've kind of verified, like, no, there are legitimate sources in this story, and I'm still then that's not propaganda. But if you're looking at an image and a headline and it's really burnishing someone's reputation, or it's really slamming someone's reputation, then that may be propaganda, and that's worth looking into a little deeper. And the other things, we had that conversation about advertising, and that's true. I hadn't even really thought about advertising as propaganda. I think that, you know, with television and also with print media, we have been seeing advertising for so long that it's part of our vocabulary, and that we know, okay, this is an ad break, and people are paying for these ads, and that's separate from the news, right? So I think people do kind of understand that that's what advertising is. I think it's more problematic when you're getting propaganda, or essentially ads that are being put out there as if they were news. And then I think there are other kind of small gray areas. People don't know, for instance, that, and I didn't know till I worked at a local news station, that we don't have a choice. We have to run political ads. We can't pick and choose which political ads we show. So people will get angry, and there's a federal law around that, or an FCC law. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it's I'm not sure about the exact regulation. I just know that, you know, we can't choose one candidate or the other. People get angry, like, why are you running this political ad from this candidate that I don't like, because he's clearly lying in the ad? And it's like, we actually don't have a choice. Like, we have to run those. So there is a bit, in terms of advertising, there is a bit of, again, explaining to the public why we do certain things. And people, I've gotten Facebook comments in the past, well, you're just trying to get clicks on this story. And you just didn't. Yeah, I am. Like, that is one of the ways in which we make money. It is still for-profit media. So, I'm sure that we could do a better job, even around the edges, explaining to people why we run certain ads, or now where there is some gray area that we didn't used to have, we have sponsored segments. So advertisers will actually put their name maybe on a series of stories. And I don't know that people understand that advertiser isn't choosing the stories, and they're not writing the stories, and they're not necessarily even telling us who to go cover. They've just got their name in the graphic in the introduction to the story, and everything else editorially is still left up to us. But I could see that not being clear to people. And I've noticed that even in terms of web traffic, is that people think that story is just an advertisement. So they even avoid it when they see it online, because it looks like it's an ad for that business that's sponsoring that series. But in fact, they're just putting their name on the front of the story, and the rest of the editorial is coming from the newsroom. Or the fact that our advertising sales is separate from our newsroom, and we don't make decisions together other than so-and-so is going to sponsor this series. So that gets into the weeds a little bit, and it does get back to transparency, but also like the blurriness between advertising and news. It's certainly there, and we could probably do a better job talking about it.
In similar vein, how would you all define misinformation, and then how is that different from disinformation?
So disinformation, I'll start with that. Disinformation is manufacturing facts to persuade a person to one's point of view. It is the deliberate attempt to mislead somebody and to create a false point of view. And history is just filled with those types of things. Misinformation is passing along information that is wrong or flawed without really knowing that it is. So I'll pick a name out of the news. If I actually print false facts about Donald Trump, vile, awful, false facts that have no basis in truth, that is disinformation. And I post that online, and somebody in, Broken Axle, Nebraska reads that and says, oh, I really agree with that, I'm going to repost that. That's misinformation that has the result of my actual intent to deliberately mislead somebody. And that's what it is. Governments engage in both. They actually have been known, including ours, to lie about situations, about facts, about conditions. And then there are other times when they shade the truth. That is not disinformation. It's just not quite the accurate information that we would like to have.
I like that Chris is giving very specific and articulate definitions of some of these things. I always think of, well, since I brought up what I think is a made-up town, Broken Axle, Nebraska. I actually thought of a story that I had about, it wasn't my story, a story that came out of a real town, Broken Bow, Nebraska. And this is an example of misinformation. There was a controversy in the town about senior photos and kids wanting their firearms in their senior photos. So what we're talking about are, hunting, right? Basically like hunting rifles, shotguns. A lot of these schools, including around here, have trap shooting teams. So, and a lot of kids are hunters, especially when we're talking about Western Nebraska or Central Nebraska. And so they wanted them in their senior photos, and somehow this got picked up by Mother Jones, which is a legitimate news organization. They have a left-wing point of view, but if you know that going in, you're like, this is their point of view, but they do legitimate reporting. But it got picked up by their blog, and they chose a stock image that was not accurate. It was like a kid with her sunglasses down on her nose, and it was clearly like out of Getty Images or Shutterstock or something. And like two pistols in the air like this. That isn't what those photos look like. There was a bunch of people in Omaha having an emotional reaction to that photo and to that headline and to the Mother Jones article. They didn't go. So it was something that was sort of like, and I don't think Mother Jones was doing it on purpose, but it was almost like lying based on truth or using facts to lie. But it was certainly misleading, even if it wasn't deliberately misleading. So then people were sharing this blog post out from Mother Jones, and they weren't going to, a news article from Kearney or Grand Island or their local newspaper to begin with. And people in Omaha were the people that were most incensed about it. But the photo that was used wasn't accurate. The headline really wasn't accurate, and it provided no context. So that's not disinformation. I don't think anyone in that scenario was attempting to intentionally mislead, but it was misinformation simply because the context around it was inaccurate. And that's an example where people had just drilled down to the source of news that was closest on the ground to the original story, they would have learned a whole different type of story. And at that point, views were so set in the Facebook argument that when I shared actual senior photos that were being discussed, not from that community, but examples of senior photos that were being discussed, they didn't believe me. And they were making all kinds of assumptions about me because people's views were just so set in on whether this was right or wrong, because they had all of this misinformation. So sometimes misinformation is just coming out of incorrect context, I think.
And I want to clarify. I know Broken Axle is a fictitious.
No, I know that you know.
I didn't want to smear anybody in any town. And I have a friend who actually says most towns in Nebraska should be called Broken Axle because why the hell else would you stop and establish a town?
Right, because you're driving. No, I got that it was a joke. It's just that makes me think of like an actual story that came out of Broken Bow.
Yes,
yeah,
that was great. We actually had that.
I have a T-shirt that says, Nebraska, you'll probably drive through us sometime. It's just a map of Nebraska and I-80. But yeah, what I thought was interesting about that Broken Bow story too is the people in the greater Omaha area were the ones that were arguing with me and smearing me with assumptions about who I was, versus a couple friends in the Bay Area who also shared it. And when I explained to them, their response was like, oh, okay, I get it now. Like they listened to me, but other Midwesterners were actually less open-minded. And I think that's the other thing is like having an open mind and having the emotional intelligence to say, okay, wait a minute, are my assumptions correct here? And being able, but the other thing that, and I don't remember how I responded, it probably wasn't very nice. I'm a little bit more diplomatic. I think it's important to correct misinformation and disinformation when you find it and when your friends are sharing it, but do it politely, do it in a way that helps people save face. I always say, hey, this is actually confusing, but I did because this alarmed me when I saw it too. So I did a little digging, and this is the context, or this is what I found. And I'm sure that there are people in my hometown that still think I'm an annoying know-it-all. But they've probably thought that since first grade. And I do think like it is important to correct it, but don't be a jerk about it, because then people don't listen to you anyway. And remember that you're not just talking to that one person who got the information wrong. You're talking to everyone who reads that thread. So if you're on Facebook and you're correcting a thread, and I will do that sometimes, I have to ignore a lot, but if it's something where I can step in and say, okay, here's the actual information, I at least try to be nice, because I know everyone else reading that who isn't commenting at all may still be consuming that information. And so it is important to jump in there and say, I think that this thing that everyone is talking about, there's more context behind it, or here's a more, this is how I do it a lot. Here's a more in-depth story from the city newspaper from the city where this story takes place. And so you're kind of educating people on different levels there. You're saying like, hey, go back, look at the local news source where they actually probably reported that on the ground. And here's a much longer story that provides more context. I don't know how helpful it is. I'm sure there are people that still think that I'm a goody two shoes for doing that, but
well, I mean, to that point, I've seen things that my friends have posted that I know are wrong, and I'll send them just a private message, because nobody wants, I mean, we've all probably sadly gotten into Facebook fights about stupid things, and those never end well. But like sending a private message to somebody and just saying, hey, you might want to take that down, because it's just, here's why it's wrong, and I'm just trying to be your friend. And some of my friends have respected that, and others I'm not friends with anymore. And that's okay. I could speak to them in public if I saw them and all of that, but just to, and I would hope people would do that for me too if I did that, because I'm sure I have.
I want to follow up on one thing that Katrina said. Some of the greatest emotion elicitors in us are photographs, and in the world of disinformation and misinformation, but certainly disinformation, you will find a photograph that just immediately angers you. And she mentioned Getty Images and Shutterstock, and those are two places that consumers can go and find out when that photo was taken, because many of the photos that make us angry were taken 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago in a completely different context, but they're being used today as clickbait, or to make us angry, or to elicit an emotion that is 5 years old or 2 years old, or things like that. And that's what we're talking about when we're saying drill down a little bit into the story. How legitimate is that photograph? If it was taken by Getty Images yesterday, it will say, if it was a a Magnum photo from a few days ago, it will say there. But if it was 4 or 5 years ago, it's being used as propaganda. It's being used for disinformation.
And like we use Associated Press, and their photos always have a date on them. And then they always credit, usually credit the photographer as well. And there's some caption or context, because there are times when I was a digital manager, which was, 6 weeks ago, I'd have to use an older photo of, say, the governor, because I didn't have a picture of the governor, but it would still say, at least it would say like file on it. So that it's not from that specific event, which, by the way, is another way to help. It's another clue or another signal that this is a legitimate news organization, because they're disclosing where that photo is from and when it was taken. And if it's an old photo, they should say it. Doesn't mean that mistakes don't happen. Doesn't mean that things don't get mislabeled, but you should look for overall kind of trends and signals like that.
How do you all feel? Just, this is kind of I'm jumping in here, but now that we've entered this age of artificial intelligence, and we've all seen images that are coming from AI just based on prompts and all of that, how concerned are you about that tool and how that might be used? And on the other hand, how might that be used to make journalism more effective?
Not allowed to use AI even to do research, and I think it's because my station, speaking about another thing that people don't understand, like we are a CBS affiliate. We're owned by Scripps. So the same people that do the National Spelling Bee own TV stations around the country. And Scripps Legal does not want us using AI, at least not right now, even to do research. And some of that's just the potential for legal liability for I'm blanking, plagiarism. Which all of you as university professors are familiar with as well. They don't want us accidentally plagiarizing and using somebody else's work. And I was that was one of the main reasons. I think there are probably other legal liabilities where it could be violating privacy, or we could end up using an image that we don't actually have permission to use, those kinds of things. I don't know. AI is still in its infancy. I haven't messed around with it much. Jim, I know you did a little bit of research with it. I think it could down the road be a helpful tool for when you're doing like big data journalism pieces, right? Grabbing statistics or grabbing information. But the thing they are using it for, which probably should scare all on-air people, you see AI voiced stories now. It may just be headlines at this point. And actually, you saw it, I think, on my channel before I did, Jim. I didn't even realize that they were using it, but it was right now it's kind of like filler. So you see these kind of headlines in between bigger stories. But yeah, I mean, I think that's coming. I don't know if there's a way back from it, or that's necessarily.
There is not. It will move forward.
Yeah.
I am really scared of it as a journalism teacher and as a journalist. I mean, I spent a lifetime not only teaching but as a journalist as well, and it really frightens me because I mean we've always been able to manipulate photographs. I was a high school photographer. If I wanted to, I could manipulate the photographs. I learned that, as a high school junior. It's not that hard to do. It's even easier to do now with electronics. Video was a little bit harder to do, but it's not anymore given, and you can simply manufacture things now with AI, and I haven't played around with it much at all. AI actually has been used in a lot of newspapers to write high school sports stories on Friday night when there are 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 high school teams that you need to cover. You have that many reporters. And so there's somebody in the newsroom plugging in the facts and the story gets generated. And they've been doing that for a number of years. And really nobody can tell the difference. It's when it begins to creep in that it's seamless. And that's what scares me. It is seamless. YouTube videos, and YouTube is the world's time suck. YouTube is voiced by AI. There are AI images on YouTube, and people spend a lot of time there. And when it begins edging into newsrooms beyond the high school sports story, I think that's a time legitimately to be nervous. If there's somebody relying on the facts and plugging it into AI to write it, is that a problem, especially if it goes through an editor before it goes on? I don't know. We have fewer and fewer people in newsrooms anymore, especially in print media. Is that a problem as long as it's based on facts, written by AI, edited by somebody who's actually sitting there to make sure that it did come out accurately? I leave that for people that are way smarter than I am.
We've reduced the number of people in our newsroom. Now they've cut some of the digital positions, and some of that will be automated. Now, whether that you call that AI or not, I don't know, but we've got a more automated control room. We've got a more automated cameras. But one thing that cutting some of those positions has done is meant more reporters on the ground, right? So AI can't go to like I did yesterday, go to a board of supervisors meeting. At least yet, it can't go to a board of supervisors meeting in a small town in Iowa and say that story's going to have to wait, but that could be a story today. But I'm still now a one-man band as a reporter as it is because of technology that's possible. I already have concerns about that we all have to be wary of, which is, just the amount of time it takes to do everything. If I'm shooting, editing, writing, sourcing the story, and I have to turn a story around just about every day, it leaves me less time to even fact check, or to really go in depth with a story. So could AI maybe do some of that for me, or could I, plug in the basic facts, or could it, there's already software that could do this potentially, like analyze do voice to text, and then I've got a faster log, and I can pull those quotes out of the story. There are a lot of ways that technology could potentially help us, but yeah, I mean, what worries me the most, so switching gears, what worries me the most is the potential, as Chris brought up, for disinformation on places like YouTube and on social media, because you can make it look like Joe Biden or Donald Trump or whoever said something that they didn't really say. Yeah. And then that just increases, I think it increases not just skepticism, it increases cynicism. Because then, like, if everything is fake, then nobody believes anything, and you can do whatever you want.
So I have a follow-up question. You've already given us several tips and tricks to be able to be more discriminating. So my question is, how do you recommend folks being able to advocate for media literacy? And following that, I would love to hear what you all have going on today in this realm of media literacy.
I think parents of young children should begin right now to develop that sense of questioning, that sense of curiosity, where when something is read, when the child reads something, or when you read to the child, take a moment to explain why it's trustworthy, why it may need a little more research before we accept it. I think it needs to be part of the curriculum in schools, and that's a heavy lift because school districts are all independent, and it's a very heavy lift to do, and schools have a lot to do already. Adding one more thing is a lot, and yet it does go along with education, with writing, with reading, with science, with math, and especially with civics. It all coalesces in that, and so that's where I think we need to spend more time. It's late for most of us adults. It's not impossible, but really, if we start with the students, I think we have down the road in 20 or 30 years, and yes, it is 20 or 30 years down the road. It's not an immediate payoff. It is an investment, and it is an investment in the improvement of our political climate and in our political participation. The project that I have going on right now is actually so nerdy and so academic, but it's exploring a new model of mass communication theory. There was a book written back in the 1950s called 4 Theories of the Press, and the authors back then identified libertarianism, social responsibility, Soviet communism, and authoritarian as 4 theories of the press. And I'm not gonna, I would take another hour to explain all of those. Over the years, a fifth one has been added called the developmental theory of the press. And there's simply explanations of how the press operate. Libertarian is pretty much hands-off. It's kind of the way our print news media operate. Social responsibility is a little more like our broadcast operate. Soviet communism is obvious. There is no Soviet yet, and the Chinese communism is a little bit different. And then authoritarianism is where the government, the media are privately owned, but the government puts a very heavy hand on them. I think there's actually a sixth area, and that is the area that operates in Mexico and in Afghanistan and in some other places where the media actually are privately owned. The government has a hands. There are no laws governing how the media are supposed to operate. There are external factors like warlords, drug lords, cartels, who so intimidate reporters through murders, kidnappings, ransoms, all of those things, that journalism is actually stifled, and you end up with journalism deserts in those countries. And so that's the area that I'm kind of exploring, the areas where people have no access, period, to information.
Thank you, Chris. What about you, Katrina?
Well, I would say, for one thing, support your local media if at all possible. Subscribe to your local newspapers. The newspapers are hurting, and I get it. It's expensive. They're shrinking in size. But Chris brought up news deserts and communities that are news deserts, the meaning like their local paper. Usually it's the local paper that's gone under, or they've lost a lot of their local news sources. There's less voter participation. People are less, and this has all been, you can actually verify this. I think there have been studies around less voter participation, more corruption, and less well-informed voters. So I would say, keep supporting your local news, whatever that can look like for you. And then I agree, it's got to start young, and I think it could probably be weaved into curriculum without really changing curriculum. I keep thinking about the pandemic and how I specifically thought about my 7th grade life sciences class, because people would say things like, well, it's just a theory. And I kept thinking, no, it's a scientific theory. You don't know what a theory is not just an idea. It's actually something that's been tested, and like all science is theoretical. But I learned that in 7th grade. So if you can somehow weave in media literacy into all of these other topics and how to evaluate, is this story about science? In a science class, is this a story about science that actually is well reported? That might be, maybe that's one way to do it. I don't know. And I'm sure that there are educators that would have a much better idea of how that could be worked in. And then, of course, the way social media affects kids in general is a kind of hot topic right now, and will continue to be, I think, for a long time. What do I have going right now? Well, over the last 6 weeks, I just switched to being an on-camera reporter, which is not a typical career path, but nothing about my career path has been typical. Usually that's somebody starts out in their 20s as an on-camera reporter, or they're on a different track. So at 48, to be what we call an MMJ, or multimedia journalist, is, for the first time, is unusual. I have been using my Instagram account to do little 90-second videos on media literacy, and not complex issues. I may eventually, but some of the topics that we've talked about today, I haven't even included yet. I'm doing very simple things like why we don't put every missing person on our website or on our newscast, because people will call the newsroom and say, well, my 16-year-old's been missing for 24 hours. How why isn't this being publicized? And they don't realize, first of all, just as an example, how common that is. And we have certain parameters that we have to walk through. We will publicize a missing persons case, for example, but we have to walk through certain parameters before we do that. So that's just one example, but I've been talking about questions like that I get about working in the media, or just what my day is like and how much I'm now expected to do, and how that puts limitations on me and what we can do as well. So if it's just at Katrina Markle at Instagram, if anyone is interested in seeing what I'm talking about on there, I'm planning on continuing to do it, because I also think pulling back the curtain is part of creating trust.
This has been great, and it's been I was completely unsurprised that both of you would have a lot of thoughts and feelings about all of this, and some really good guidance for us on this from a range of perspectives. And so thank you so much for being with us today. Trip, Chris, Have a great trip.
Thank
And
you.
Katrina, I hope your story this afternoon goes great. We'll look forward to seeing everybody again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all this information on media literacy. Like, I knew it definitionally, but the examples you provided and the tips and tricks are something I'll definitely use. And I will follow you on Instagram, Katrina.
Okay.